Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my mid-season Formula E statistical review of each of the 22 drivers. And so I've got everything arranged here based on the teammate pairings in team's championship order. So we got Jaguar at the top and Mahindra at the bottom. I'm going to go through team by team and kind of compare all the stats I've kind of compiled over the course over the first half of this season 10 of Formula E. So first, before I do that, I just want to go over each of the categories just so that it's pretty clear what I'm talking about. So first we have qualifying head-to-head just from the group stage, not including the duels. Qualifying delta, this is the median qualifying gap between the drivers. Average starting position, pretty self-explanatory. Average finishing position, points, championship rank. And then we have actually championship probability. So this was based on 2000 Monte Carlo runs that I did. So there's a margin of error of like plus or minus 1%, which is relevant a bit lower down. Then we have point above expected. If you watch my Formula 1 videos, I introduced this last year and I've now adapted it for Formula E as well. So basically it's how many points above what they were expected to get based on how good their car is and their starting position, and then that expressed as a percentage. And then last, we have average position on my power ranking following by overall rank. So starting with Jaguar, qualifying very, very close, 4-4 apiece between Cassidy and Evans, but Cassidy does have the advantage in delta, 0.033 seconds. For average starting position, Evans is actually the one who comes out on top here, 6.75 for Evans, 7.63 for Cassidy. But when you look at how that starting position is converted into finishing position, Cassidy 3.33, best on the board by a long shot. Of course, I think if without those two DNFs for Cassidy at Sao Paulo and the first race in Misano, probably leading the championship right now. Evans a bit of a rougher ride, 6.25, so still improving on his starting position, but not as much as Cassidy is doing. In points, Cassidy has the advantage there, 95. For him, second in the championship, Evans 77 points, fifth in the championship. Now for championship probability of winning the championship as of right now, for Cassidy it's 24.6%, and for Evans it is 7.4%. I should say as well for that category, if a driver has less than 1% odds, of course pretty much every driver is still mathematically in it, but if there's a driver with less than 1% odds, I didn't bother writing the number down. Now for points above expected, Cassidy 17.9 or 124%, definitely better than Evans's minus 8.6, which is 90%. So it does suggest that Cassidy's generally getting a bit more out of the car in the races. Average spot on my power rankings, for Cassidy 5.8, which is third over all the drivers, and for Evans 9.0, which is seventh. So I think overall for the Jaguars, I think both drivers have had decent starts to the year. Definitely Cassidy's, I think, had a bit the upper hand, particularly in the races. But Evans has been on a pretty good streak, pretty good run the last several races. Now moving on to Porsche, second in the team's championship. Qualifying not particularly close, and this is basically the big difference. When you look at all the stats overall, this is really the big difference between the drivers. Verline 8-0 in qualifying head-to-head in the group stage. Median qualifying delta 0.286, so just over 0.2 of a second, which is pretty massive in Formula E terms. Average starting position, Verline, best qualifier to start this year, 3.88 is his average starting position. For DaCosta, 14.50, so over 10 positions behind Verline in the same car, which is just frankly unacceptable. It's basically impossible for DaCosta to make up that gap in the races. So for average finishing position, Verline does fall back a little bit, 5.88 average finishing position, but that's going to be skewered by that one race in Misano. For DaCosta, is able to improve average finishing position of 10.67, although recently it has been better than it was at Mexico and in Diriyah. Now looking at points, Verline 102 points, of course, leading the championship right now, and DaCosta 26 points in 10th. For Verline, of course, leading the championship, you would expect him to have the best odds of winning, and of course he does, 34.4% odds of winning the championship. And for DaCosta, less than 1% at this point in the season. In terms of expected points above expected, actually both drivers are very close and they're both in the negatives here. So for Verline, negative 3.6, 96%, and Acosta negative 3.5, 88%. So Verline very, very close to kind of basically performing as expected in the races. But it really shows that the reason that he's leading the championship has been his really strong qualifying performance. Excellent in the qualifying. Races are still good, I would say. But yeah, that qualifying performance is really carrying him to his position in the championship. Looking at average, my power rankings for Verline 4.7, second best driver I feel to start the season, and for DaCosta 11.7, which is ninth. So even though the qualifying performances have been really poor, the race performance I do feel he's been a bit better. And of course, with that win that was taken away from him in the first race in Misano, with that he would be at 50 points, and yeah, much closer to being Verline points wise. Moving on to Andretti, third in the team's championship. For qualifying, not that close for head-to-head. Dennis leads 6-2 there, but the qualifying delta is very close, 0.092 seconds. And for both drivers, they've really struggled in qualifying, and we saw how strong Dennis was, particularly last year. So it really feels like, for whatever reason, Andretti's really struggling to set up the car for qualifying. Average starting position 11.5 for Dennis, and Nato 14.6. But when you look at average finishing position, you see a massive improvement for Dennis, 6.63, so he's basically gaining about 5 positions on average every race. And for Nato, 11.0, so still improving 3 positions or so, but obviously not by as much as Dennis. For points, 89 points for Dennis, third in the championship. For Nato, 24 points, 13th in the championship. And for Dennis, 14.8% chance of winning this year's title. Now, looking at points above expected, Dennis doing much better than you would expect based on the strength of the car and based on his starting position. 45.2 points above expected, 205%, and for Nato, negative 4.5, 84%. So a little bit worse than expected for Nato. In power rankings, Dennis 6.7, average of 5th. So ranked 5th on average, and then for Nato, 14.3, which is 17th. So for the Andretti drivers, I feel like qualifying is really hurting them down. Kind of feels a bit like what was going on with Porsche last year, where the Porsche race pace was really strong, but both drivers struggled in qualifying. And yeah, that kind of feels like what's happening with Andretti. I do feel like Dennis, if he's not able to turn around his qualifying form, consistently qualify in, I would say, top 10, I think it's going to be really hard for him to compete for the championship. Even if he does fantastic jobs with energy in the races, I feel like compared to, for example, Verline or even Cassidy or Evans, if they're consistently qualifying above him, it's going to be really hard to compete for the title when you're consistently at a disadvantage there. Moving on to Nissan, Roland and Fenestras, probably the surprise package of the season, I would say, and probably the surprise driver of the season as well. So for qualifying, 6-2 in favor of Roland. Average qualifying margin is 0.07 in favor of Roland. Average starting position 9.63 for Roland, and for Fenestras 12.88. So an advantage across the board for Roland, which I think is a bit of a surprise given how strong Fenestras was in qualifying. But of course, prior to his season at Mahindra last year, we always knew that Roland was a very quick qualifier, and we're kind of seeing that again this year. Now, when we get to the races, for Roland, 5.57 for average finishing position. For Fenestras, 8.86. So both drivers are improving on their qualifying position as well. Points, Roland 4th in the championship, 88 points. For Fenestras, 24 points, 12th in the championship. So Roland really is in that championship fight, 4th in the championship and all, and his odds of winning the championship, 14.8. Exactly the same as Dennis in the simulation when I did yesterday. Of course, it's a margin of error plus or minus 1%, which is why they're tied. Now, moving to expected points, Roland 21.8 points above expected, 137%. For Fenestras, negative 7.7, 76%. So really feels like Fenestras is underperforming a bit in the races, and Roland, I think, is doing a really great job. And even with him losing that win in Misano, still well into the positives there. So you would imagine if he was able to finish that race, convert that into a win, the point total would be even better for that points above expected category. Now, average power rankings for Roland, 4.2 first, and for Fenestras, 13.5, which is 15th. So I do feel like Roland has been the best driver to start the season. Been unlucky with that DNF in Misano. Now, moving on to DS Penske, a little bit disappointing, I would say, at the start of the season. For qualifying, 6-2 in favor of Verne, but the average qualifying margin 0.077, so still pretty close there. Average starting position 5.5 for Verne and Van Dorn 8.5. So last year was almost identical between Van Dorn and Verne in qualifying. This year, Verne does have a bit more of an advantage. And when we look at those numbers in comparison to average finishing position, Verne and Van Dorn are both pretty good drivers, and despite that, their numbers actually get worse comparing starting position to finishing position. So for Verne, 6.5, and for Van Dorn, 8.86. And of course, generally, drivers' finishing position will on average be a little bit better than their starting position, simply because when drivers DNF, it means that you don't have drivers finishing in the bottom slots, 21st, 22nd or so. And that, of course, then shuffles everyone up the order. For points, Verne, 65 points, 7th in the championship, a bit of an outsider for the title at this point, 3.2% championship odds. Pretty long odds, and I do think the car is not quite as strong as the Jaguar or the Porsche powered cars, so I think for there it even makes it a bit more of a disadvantage. For Van Dorn, 37 points, 9th in the championship, not really in the championship fight at this stage. For points above expected, negative 1.1 for Verne, 98%, and for Van Dorn, negative 11.2 or 77%. So definitely feel like across the board, Verne's been the better driver, and that kind of comes out in my power rankings. 7.2 for Verne, which is 6th, and Van Dorn 11.7, which is 10th. Moving on to Maserati, this is kind of a complete whitewash across the board for Gunther. Qualifying 7-1 advantage for Gunther there, and average median qualifying delta is 0.589, so over half a second between Gunther and Daruvula, which is simply too big in Formula E, given that the field spread is often well under 0.6 of a second. So having that much of a field spread between teammates is just not really acceptable, and that's something that Daruvula really needs to try to work on in the second half of the season. Was better at Monaco, but has to be like that consistently. Average starting position, this of course you can see where Daruvula is really getting hurt with his qualifying. For Gunther, average starting position 9.25, Daruvula 15.75. Average finishing position in the races 6.75 for Gunther, 16.17 for Daruvula. So for Gunther, definitely improving in the races. For Gunther improving in the races. For Daruvula, somehow getting worse, and that 16.17 is the worst. I believe the worst on the board, and worse than all 6 drivers in the bottom 3 teams. So we know that Maserati car is better than the ERT, it's better than the Abt, it's better than the Mahindra, but despite that, Daruvala's average finishing position is still worst of all 22 full-time drivers. I do know there's been some races with bad luck and everything, but the reality is drivers have to be able to make their own good luck and be able to recover from things that kind of are outside of their control. Championship points, if you're a Daruvula fan, better to turn away, not watch this part. For Gunther, 65 points, 6th in the championship. Daruvula, 2 points, 19th in the championship. For championship profit odds, for Gunther, still kind of in this fight, 2.7% on the simulation run. Of course, he is tied with Verne, and I believe he would have the, by having a win, he would have the tiebreaker there, but of course, margin of -1 or plus or minus 1%. So yeah, that 3.2 for Verne, 2.7 for Gunther, definitely within that range. Now looking at points above expected, for Gunther, 222.1, 153%, so definitely making up, doing better than expected in the races. For Daruvula, minus 16.0 or 11%. So yeah, really poor for Daruvula in that category. For power rankings, for Gunther, 6.0, 4th, so 4th best driver, and then for Daruvula, 18.3, 22nd and dead last. Now, moving on to McLaren, we have Bird and Hughes. Hughes coming out and topping qualifying here, 5-2 in favor of Hughes. Average median qualifying delta, 0.116. But when we look at starting positions, Bird actually has the advantage here, 9.86 for Bird, for Hughes 11.13, and that's because for one of the races, I believe the first race in Misano, Hughes had to start from the 22nd, because I think he either had a penalty of some kind or he got all of his laps deleted. So yeah, for Hughes, that's obviously why he would end up that much worse. But when we look at conversion into average finishing position for Bird, 9.6, so able to make up a little bit of ground. For Hughes, 10.43, so still behind Bird there. And then when we look at points, for Bird, 38 points, 8th in the championship. Hughes, 25 points, 11th in the championship. So pretty close, one of the closer teammate battles there. And of course, Bird missing the last race at Monaco. Hopefully his hand's okay, and hopefully he's able to return stronger than ever next time out. But for our points above expected here, for Bird, 10.1, 136%, and for Hughes, negative 10.1, 67%. And of course, for Bird, it got that race win, and that definitely plays a massive part in his points tally, accounting for over half of his points from just that one race. Average power rankings, let's see, we have for Bird, we have 13.2, and then for Bird, and then 12.8 for Hughes. So I feel like Hughes has been slightly better, 14th for Bird and 13th overall ranking for Hughes. Alright, before I lose my voice, I'm going to power through with this. So for fines, now we move on to Envision, arguably the worst, probably the most disappointing team, I would say, of Formula E this year. I don't think it's the powertrain. We know the powertrain is the same as the Jaguar, and I made this comment, and my power rankings were, if you didn't know any better, you would think that they were driving completely different cars, completely different powertrains. But anyway, so for Fines and Buemi, for qualifying, 7-1 advantage for Fines. So Buemi was actually quite strong in qualifying last year against Cassidy. This year against Fines, it's not really going that well. 7-1, like I said. Average median qualifying delta, 0.18 for Fines. Average starting position, 9.13 for Fines. For Buemi, 12.43. And when you compare this to the Jaguar drivers, Fines is honestly not too bad, but still definitely a step behind. And for Buemi, it's definitely not really acceptable when you're driving a car that's good. That's that good. When we look at average finishing position for Fines, 12.17, so he's losing 3 positions on average every race. And for Buemi, 10.83, so improving a little bit, but not that much. And not really enough to really make up massive ground in the race and get big points. And a lot of that 10.3 is going to be that second place that he got in the opening race of the season. For points, 21 points for Fines, 20 points for Buemi, 14th and 15th in the championship. A far cry from their engine supplier Jaguar with 95 points and 77 points there. When we look at points above expected for Fines, they're both in the negatives. For Fines, negative 12.1, 64%, and for Buemi, negative 4.2, which is 82%. And because of how I calculate this, I calculate each team independently, but if I basically use the numbers from the Jaguar powertrain and use that to calculate their numbers, both of them would be much, much worse and much further in the negative there. For power rankings, 15.8 for Fines, 13.7 for Buemi, 19th and 16th respectively. So I do feel like both drivers have really underperformed this year. And yeah, I do wonder if both of them will get brought back for season 11 next year. For now, moving into the bottom three teams, of course, with these teams, it's a bit of a lottery every race. Starting with ERT, where it's probably most noticeable the fact that kind of the lottery, results that we've had. So for qualifying, 1-7 in favor of Statistical, probably the most surprising qualifying head-to-head in Formula E this year, given that last year was basically the complete opposite in favor of Tictum. Median qualifying delta 0.42 seconds, which is second biggest of all the teammate battles, only behind Gunther and Derula. Not sure why Tictum struggled so much in qualifying. It was his strength last year, and now it's really, really hurting him. For starting position, 18.0 for Tictum, which I believe is worst on the board, and for Statistical, 11.29, which is actually the best in those bottom three teams. For average finishing position, for Tictum, 14.86, so able to make up ground, but it's hard not to when you're starting so far back. And for Statistical, is falling back a little bit, and the race is 12.5. That's really understandable. But so you would think, looking at all these numbers, that Statistical would surely be ahead in the Drivers' Championship. Well, no, that's not actually the case. For Tictum, 12 points, 17th in the championship. Statistical, 11 points, 18th in the championship. And it was basically that one result in Misano where Tictum somehow got a fourth place, got 12 points, that he was able to leapfrog his teammate Statistical. And that really shows up here when we look at points above expected, where in this case it's not necessarily a skill-based stat, but it's really kind of a luck-based stat in some respects. So for Tictum, 8.6 points above expected, which is 355 points, 355%. For Statistical, a little bit less than expected, negative 1.7, 87%. But really, when you look at my power rankings, I think it's more reflective of how I felt the two drivers have done this year. For Tictum, 17.2, which is 21st, second last, and for Statistical, 12.5, which is 12th overall. Moving on to Apt, this one, another qualifying where it's not particularly close. Muller has the edge 7-1, and it's really starting to make that comparison last year between Muller and Fines. It's starting to back up kind of the results that we saw there, given that we know Degrassi, while he is older, he's still an excellent driver. Median qualifying delta 0.209 there, so big advantage for Muller. And average starting position 11.67, second best amongst those bottom three teams. And then Degrassi 16.5. Never been the strongest qualifier Degrassi has. Average finishing position in the race, Muller is somehow the same, 11.67, despite being in a pretty weak car, and Degrassi 13.67. Average for points in championship, 18 points for Muller, 16th in the championship, best amongst those bottom three teams, and then for Degrassi, 1 point in 20th in the championship. Average points above expected, Muller's at 3 points above expected, 119%, and for Degrassi, negative 3.4 or 23%. Average power rankings, 10.8 for Muller, which is 8th, and then 14.7 for Degrassi, which is 18th. For now, final team, moving on to Mahindra, arguably probably the most disappointing team this year. Qualifying 6-2 in favor of Mortara, negative 1.58 is the median gap there in favor of Mortara. Average starting position 3.38 for Mortara, and then for De Vries 17.5, which I think is kind of surprising, given in Gen 2, De Vries was seen as one of the stronger qualifiers, very, very close in qualifying pace with Van Dorn, who was his teammate back then. I guess we can kind of give him a bit of leeway, given that it is he does have a bit of a disadvantage testing-wise with these new Gen 3 cars, as he didn't participate in Formula E last year. But still, it's a bit surprising. Qualifying was his strength when he was in Gen 2, and yeah, so it's a bit odd to see him struggling here. Average finishing position, 12.8 for Mortara, 14.7 for De Vries. So both of them making up positions in the races. Points are none. They have no points. Mortara was very, very close to getting points in Tokyo. Unfortunately, got disqualified for using too much energy. So yeah, no points, 21st and 22nd in the championship. And when we look at points above expected, when your drivers have no points, it's kind of hard. It's basically impossible, actually, to be a plus in this category. So negative 10.5 for Mortara. A lot of that comes from when he started so high up in Tokyo. 0% there. And then for De Vries, negative 3.9. Again, 0%. So in that category, Mortara would be expected to score some points at least, certainly more than De Vries. But I do feel like Mortara has been the better of the two Mahindra drivers, 12.2 on my power rankings, 11th overall, but for De Vries, 16.3 and 20th. So there you go. Those are all 11 teammate head-to-heads. And kind of a statistical kind of analysis review of how I felt about their first half of the season. Just finishing up this video, we're at 23 minutes already, so I don't want to go too much further. We're just going to finish up with poles, wins, and podiums for the first half of the season. So for poles, Verline, like I said, 3 poles so far, most of any driver, and then Boland has 2, and then Jeb, Evans, and Hughes all have 1 apiece. For wins, Verline's the only driver with 2, and then besides that, we have Dennis, Cassidy, Berg, Gunther, Roland, and Evans with 1 each. Really reminding me of Season 5 in a way, where we had that really ridiculous run to start the year of different drivers winning races. I really feel like, I think, especially in the second half of the season, we're going to start seeing a lot of repeat wins, especially from those drivers in the championship fight. Realistically, I think the only driver who hasn't won yet, who I think could win, I guess, would be Vern, maybe, perhaps, and maybe DaCosta, if he can kind of put together a really solid weekend again. When we're looking at podiums, interesting to see that Cassidy is first with 5th, and then we have Dennis and Roland with 4 each. Verline leading the championship only has 2 podiums, so we got those 2 wins and then nothing else. So definitely a bit of a surprise, and it's something that Verline's going to want to work on. It's something that could hurt him in the second half of the season if that kind of form continues. Because you can have drivers like Cassidy or perhaps Evans or Dennis who are able to consistently rack up podiums And if you're only getting on podium, twice in 8 races, that might not be enough in the second half of the season. So Gunther also 2 podiums, Evans 2 as well, and then we have Jeb Bird, Van Dorn, Fines, and Buemi each with 1 podium. So there you go, statistical review of the first half of Season 10 of Formula E. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I doubt anyone's going to be watching all the way to the 25-minute mark, but well, who cares? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.